The following is an interview with Professor Greg Carr of Howard University, conducted by Lindsay Stewart at the Penn State University as part of the 2012 National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute on Contemporary African American Literature.
Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Carr.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
We're glad to have you. So how would you describe your approach to teaching African American literature?
I guess jazz would be a cute way of saying it, but
okay.
Very improvisational. My training is not in African American literature. It's in African American studies.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a consequence, I kind of look at all texts as opportunities to explore the ways that people of African descent have inscribed reality, their reality as they experience it. So for me, literature, I don't look at it, I think, the way that folks who are trained in African American literature
mm-hmm.
or some field look at it. So I kind of come in and out as it fits whatever we're exploring at any given moment.
Has your approach changed over the years?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The central defining element of my work is the search for genealogies, intellectual genealogies, relationships between people of African descent and thinkers who try to represent not only their interpretations, but what they believe groups of black people are thinking. So my approach changes every time somebody says or does something interesting that I try to pull into the conversation, so it's constantly changing. With that exception, there's always a look for genealogies, which is heresy for a lot of people, but I couldn't care that.
So what was your first response to Ken Warren's proclamation that African American literature is over since the demise of segregation?
Well, when I saw the book, my initial reaction was kind of visceral. Like, here's another Negro trying to make a name for himself with something cute. And then I read it, and I agree. I'm certain that he might balk at the reason, for which I agree, but very early in the text, he makes a gesture toward diaspora and talks about, the boundaries have already kind of transcended. So in some ways that might point to the idea that African American literature, as he would define it, is over. And I just laughed. I said, well, if you take that as a point of departure, then it never began. Because the whole thing's defined by race. I don't define the African experience by race. I understand race as an experience that we found ourselves subject to, that we kind of navigated and improvised our way through, and are still doing it. But when you define your identity in a raced way, as it's the central defining element, then of course it can begin and end. So I don't have any argument with Ken Warren. In fact, I wish that he would have continued to develop his kind of evoking of things like the Black Arts Movement. He kind of gestures toward, what's the brother's name? Addison Gale. He brings up Larry Neal and very quickly moves on. He brings up Du Bois, but he doesn't bring up Du Bois at the end of his life. In 1960, he gave a talk at Johnson C. Smith called Whither, Now, and Why. And his whole thesis was that I believe that, Negroes, or people of African descent, should have full and equal rights in the society, but that what we have to contribute to the society comes out of our unique cultural perspective. Warren wanted to stay with a couple of quotes from Dusk of Dawn and Souls of Black Folk. I understand, that's how you get it done. But it would have been interesting to see him pursue what it looks like beyond pre-segregation, post-segregation, and then the cherry pick, pre-19th century. Okay, Phyllis Wheatley got it, Equiano got it. Well, what about Martin Delany? What about Martin Delany? You mentioned Martin. I see what you're doing. But the people who tried to grapple seriously with questions of culture. Bishop J.T. Holly. And if you want to say diaspora, then who else is writing in the 19th century? The Haitians, for example. P.V. Vasty. Then you get to the end of the 19th century, the other people who are writing, who were trying to be in conversation around questions of culture. To me, I'm not looking for an answer as such. I'm looking for a conversation. So if you can pick out some things and say, and then you evoke Jim Crow, and then I don't care whether it's old or new Jim Crow. I don't get into that Michelle Alexander arguments, like whatever. But sure, what was African American? Sure, why not?
So what new trend or issue has interested you lately in African American literature?
I would say the one, I guess I can qualify it as a trend. The conversation that I find most interesting now is kind of connected to what I said earlier as it relates to genealogy. So it isn't so much African U.S. as much as it is continental Africans who have kind of had a diasporic experience. So the person who I hope we'll have some very interesting conversation about later today, will be Watiango, who has spent a great deal of time in the States. Has given a series of lectures over the last about 5 or 6 years that he has reduced to 2 books. One, Something Torn and New, which we'll be talking about today, and another one, Global Ethics, that came out earlier this year. His principal kind of argument is that for African people, not just on the continent, but globally, there needs to be a lot of work done around remembering, not necessarily constructing imagined identities, but engaging a discourse that both predates colonialism, predates enslavement, and also theorizes our experiences in those situations. But the conversation is very heavily reliant on what he calls translation and recovery. So how do African people access the African past? By dealing with African languages. But pairing that conversation that Ngugi has begun with the work of Aikwe Armah, who we try our level best to get out of his hiding place in Senegal earlier this year, and I'm still not giving up. He says, oh no man, I don't like to travel, but we're going to get you back out of there, because he's written a series of novels over the last 10 years. He's probably best known for his earlier work, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, 2000 Seasons, and things like that. But in the last 10 years, he has written a series of books where he tries to, through fiction, deal with this question of remembering. Osiris Rising, Kemet, and the House of Knowledge. Kemet is one of the classical African words for Egypt. He is one of the few people of African descent in the world who is expert at translating Egyptian hieroglyphs, Middle Egyptian. And as a student of Theophilo Benga, I took Middle Egyptian and understand the importance of engaging that classical tradition. So whereas Ngugi talks about how Europe basically created itself out of a reclamation of Greece and Rome, and then through the translation through Greek and Latin into the contemporary European languages, French and German, Spanish, Italian, English, created dialogue among themselves based on a common foundation. Ngugi says, Sheikh Anta Diop argues that we should do a similar thing with classical African language, but he leaves it there. What Armah does is demonstrate what that might look like, and it transforms all these conversations, class, gender. It's like, yeah, that's nice. So, the romanticizing conversation, I'm like, wait, hold it. How much of African literature, and by African literature, I mean literature produced by people of African descent, and not just literature, but people make the literature orature distinction. And I'm saying, no. How much of African inscription have you engaged? What do you mean? I read Equiano, yeah, I'm not talking Equiano too. But black people write on all kind of things. We write musically. We, write in any number of ways, material, art, this kind of thing. But if you attach it to the traditions that we created prior to enslavement and have continued to produce, it transforms the conversations. And Ngugi has talked about it, and Armah demonstrates what that might look like. His book, Kemet, for example, his novel, he tells the story through the voice of a woman of African descent. And she has a PhD in hieroglyphs, in ancient Egyptian language. And so he follows her as she attempts to engage in this process of translation. But through the text, he's demonstrating his expertise in Egyptian language and bringing in this conversation. So it's more than this kind of ideological, Pan-Africanism. No, let's get beyond that, because typically when people say that, the next step is black nationalism. And then they say, Nation of Islam, Black Panthers. Okay, take the Nation of Islam, the Black Panthers, and anybody else you read 2 lines about, and let's deal with the question of African people trying to grapple with this. Because when I see Lil Wayne, I see somebody who's not only inscribed his body, he's inscribed his music, and all his contradictions are very much more interesting to me if I look at them through the notion of Orisha, through the concept of the Ngungun. I mean, how do you deal with gender in traditions where male-female are not, as Oyewonke Oyewumi has written, somocentric, are not body-centered? And so when you go to the classical African, you see gendered positions that are not written on the body of the actual representative figures. So we get beyond this whole notion that this is a man and this is a woman exclusively.
So, how important would it be to you to bring in, you know, hip-hop fiction or graphic novels or things like that into the classroom?
Well, let's say I didn't want to at all.
At all?
Let's say I didn't want to. Let's say
Okay.
I'm against all of it.
Okay.
I would probably be able to find a nice, comfortable position, you know, burying myself in some ancient texts and just kind of shutting myself off and being this kind of deeply conservative, you know, kind of scholar, teacher more than, you know, academic in the traditional sense. But that's not my position. In fact, for me, and particularly at an HBCU, and maybe even more particularly at Howard, if I did that, I probably should resign and go somewhere where I would be able to do that and sleep at night.
Mm.
These young people are texting, tweeting, and listening. It would be impossible not to do it. So if that's the case, then the next thing to do is to jump in full body. Let's deal with this, but not deal with it on its terms. And I think that's the mistake that I often see happen in our conversations. And that's why the question, bringing it back to the question of genealogy, is so important to me. How much do you know of the intellectual genealogy of African inscription? And connect that to what you're talking about. So that it isn't just something that begins from the moment you enter the text, you enter the dialogue. And so for me, it's the best thing, because we begin often with that conversation. But then that requires students to engage the conversations that come before them. So it gets to be very interesting.
Okay, so transitioning to thinking about the Institute, how did you prepare for your sessions?
Read, reread, assume that I knew nothing, which I found to be the best way to come into a space, and then prepare to listen. It's hard for me to shut off streams. So the idea of sequestering myself and going through materials, as useful as that is, and you know, completing the academic licensure, it's difficult to do in real life. And you know, as a classroom teacher, I find myself constantly absorbing stuff. So what I tried to do is get in the right framework and just let all that stuff come and pass through as I was, you know, rereading some things, reading some new things. So I looked at Miriam Graham's Jerry Ward, I guess their new anthology on African American literature. I try to respect people in their work in the fields that they've declared that they work in. And I would never claim to be an expert on anything except my life experience, and who wants to hear about that? So, but I try to at least be aware of conversations and not try to come in and set those conversations relative to my experience as much as join the conversations. So that's kind of how I prepared, a lot of reading and rereading stuff.
Oh, thank you for your time today, Dr. Carr.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.